Today in a special episode, we'll be interviewing Dr. Jen Gunter. She's a physician, an OBGYN, and a pain medicine specialist. And she's the author of the new book, The Menopause Manifesto. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Definitely not a real doctor.
Especially not today.
Exactly.
Ali Hassan. Every episode, what we normally do is I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment and question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic for medicine and health and grills me on that topic. However, this is a special episode. Today our guest is Dr. Jen Gunter. She's a physician, an OBGYN, a pain medicine specialist, a podcaster, and really just a legend. And she's also the author of the new book, The Menopause Manifesto. Dr. Jen Gunter, welcome to Doctor versus Comedian.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Gunter, we know that you're originally from Winnipeg,
Right.
And then you did your residency at University of Western Ontario, now called Western University, and you finished there in 1995.
Yeah.
Now, I started at Western in 1996 in med school, so we just missed each other.
Oh, that's too bad. You could have shoved him up against the locker and taken some of his lunch money if you wanted to. Oh man. Anyway, I don't want you to have regrets about your career. This is what happened. That's fine. You missed each other.
I didn't even know Western changed their name.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not even sure why that they did that. I guess, maybe the Ontario was too regional. They wanted to make it just Western, like the Western part of the world. I don't know. It's quite bizarre. And then you're in Northern California now. So what took you to Northern California from Canada?
I guess I was looking to see if there was another bar besides Joe Kool's. I'm just kidding.
That's such a
very inside baseball Western reference.
The deep Western reference that only us who went there would know. Very good.
Yeah, every single person who went to Western will be like, yeah. And everybody else is like, what? So I came to the States actually to do my fellowship. And I did my fellowship at the University of Kansas, having no idea that the Midwest in the United States wasn't the same as the Midwest in Canada. Winnipeg's a pretty liberal city. And I just grew up with the Fringe Festival and just, not thinking much of anything. And then getting to sort of Kansas and being like, whoa, this is not at all like the Midwest in Canada. Very religious, very different. So I was in Kansas first. I stayed after my fellowship because they offered me a job and it just seemed like an adventure to be in another country. And then I ended up staying, and then I moved to the University of Colorado. I was there for 5 years and then finally moved out to the West Coast. And that's where I am. I'm just outside of San Francisco. And
along with your practice, many doctors just content to have a practice and that's where it ends. But you had this blog for a long time, prolific blog, huge social media presence. And then, as many people will know, including our listeners, you started having these online battles with Gweneth Paltrow and Goop. And we actually spoke about that on a previous episode of Doctor versus Comedian. But we thought we'd ask you, since we talked about it before, how did those interactions come about initially? And where is it all? Is it smoldering ashes now, or where is it? Where have you left it?
Well, I have to be careful about punching down. But so it started, I was blogging for some time and people would send you things about, is this true? Is this crazy? What is this? And so I often wrote about misinformation that people came across online, or really frank disinformation. And then one day someone tagged me in the post from Goop. And it was absolutely ridiculous. It was about vaginal steaming. It was just ludicrous. And full of every bit of sort of misinformation, just a complete lack of understanding of physiology. And so, as I wrote about it being, as ridiculous as it was, just like I wrote about everything else. I don't think it was, particularly different, but because it was, that special combination of vaginas and celebrities and that it went crazy. That was it certainly wasn't my viral post at all, but that was the one that seemed to draw more people to me afterwards. And so, when people would tag me in crazy things on Goop, I would write about it. They certainly went through this period of time where they were, really writing a lot about, I would say, sort of, women's health or sexual health and really doing it very poorly. Not so much that, really doing it very poorly, I would say. And then other things too, you get on their site and you're like, oh, raw goat's milk to cure parasites. Okay.
Or to cause parasites. Like,
right. No, exactly. And what I felt was the real danger of Goop was that you were elevating these, I would say, practitioners of, I don't even really know how else to describe them, but these sort of functional medicine and naturopathic practitioners who all have supplements to sell, who are all seem to be cash only practices, telling people things like you need to have these crazy panel of blood tests and stool tests for the systemic yeast that you don't have. And and it was really sort of elevating, not just this one bad idea, but anti-science in general. And so, so that's kind of how the Goop thing started. And then eventually after writing about it, and that's not all I wrote about. That's sort of what the popular press was interested in, but there's a lot of other stuff as well. I actually went to a Goop conference because I wanted to see it real.
That's so Vice reporter vibe right there, really go undercover and then report about like, this is what's going on there. And then that must have also just sort of your report on the conference must have also elevated this entire thing. And did you become sort of the go-to person? Like every time something new and weird comes on Goop, people are like, look at this, Dr. Gunter, let's get.
Yeah, people did. Certainly before I went to the conference, that happened. And you try not to, you have to walk the line about, is that something to write about because it's real and people are actually going to do it? Or is it something, if I just leave it alone, it's going to die a quick natural death? And some of the things I would just write about because I was interested in, something that Goop promoted a couple of years ago on their January must-buy New Year's list was, the Implantorama, which is the way to do your own coffee enemas at home.
I love that that's a must buy. I love that it's January too. You're making New Year's resolutions.
Yeah.
You want to do 20 push-ups every day. You want to drink more water. And of course, you want to
put coffee in your ass. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I got a little bit fascinated with that because obviously Gweneth Paltrow's personal physician or personal friend physician, Dr. Gunter, I think is his name, recommended it. This is the one he recommends. I'm like, who the hell is like that is so ridiculous. And so I took a deep dive because I wanted to know how did coffee enemas become a thing? There actually is a Facebook group dedicated to coffee enema aficionados. Of course. And so someone, unbeknownst to me, had infiltrated that group long before and was sending me screenshots. I didn't use any screenshots from, some people's private conversations, but it was just amazing to me to actually, I thought it was this sort of completely fringe thing, but there were more people doing it than I thought. And so all these posts on it said it was like a British military thing. And that's why. And I'm like, okay, well, military medicine from, whatever, 1900s, 1910 from the First World War, whatever, that'd be 1919. That's not what we should actually be practicing, but I got really interested in it. So there's a British Medical Military Museum. So I emailed the curator wanting to know if he'd heard about coffee enemas. And of course, I got the most delightful email back saying that this was the most interesting email that he'd ever received. And he would look into it.
And did he get back to you about that? Did he?
So he did. He got back. Anything? Absolutely. He got back to me. It's a delightfully British email, you can imagine this sort of curator who gets these what bullet is this from? All of a sudden it's coffee enemas. And so it was in a medical field guide from 1917 as a way to wake men up in the field.
Okay.
I'm like, okay, based on no science or anything. And I'm like, wouldn't it be faster to just drink it? But anyway, so yeah. That was the only sort of legitimate sort of original medical source I could find. But, sort of a lot of this pseudoscience comes from these, one-liners, these throwaway one-liners. And, and we see that just even now with lies about, about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine, we still see it today. Some people cherry pick one line and then turn it into something.
Yeah. You'd think that constant gunfire and the fear of death would keep the soldiers awake just as well as a coffee enema. But anyway, I'm not a military expert, so I'll leave it to them.
So I was actually ask you something about that because Ali and I have been listening to your new podcast, Body Stuff, which is on the TED Audio Collective. And this is kind of what you do in a lot of these episodes. You take some of these things that people just take for granted and you kind of go down that rabbit hole. Like, why do we think these things? Whether it's about milk, is milk good for you? Whether it's about how many glasses of water we need a day and things like that. So I guess just tell me maybe a bit about how the podcast kind of came to be and your involvement with TED.
Yeah. So TED asked me to do a TED talk. I'm having so much trouble like with time. Like when was that? We're all at this sort of weird, like amorphous time period, right? Yeah. Sometime in the before time. I think it was in 2019. They asked me to do a TED talk. And I decided to branch out a little bit. Everybody said me as like the vulva vagina lady. And so I decided to actually do something on periods just because I wanted to branch out a little bit, but also because a lot of times it is the backstory that really matters. And so like medicine is part of culture and society, and you can't separate the two. All doctors have opinions that are informed by society. Society decides what research we're going to do. Like, it's so intertwined that you really need to, I think, incorporate both. And so in that talk, I wanted to explain periods to people, but not in just a biological way, like what happens, but why do we bleed? Like, why do we have such heavy periods versus other animals? Why do we bleed in the way that we do? Because it's actually really quite unique. And it's all related, obviously, to the massive toll that reproduction takes. And humans have a unique biology in the sense that we can't on in the woods and get up and go, like we have these vulnerable babies that require care. And so all of everything is built for that. It's evolved for that. And sort of explaining it from sort of this evolutionary standpoint and then taking and applying it to the experiences that you have today. And so, that talk, I think, really resonated with them. And so we kind of started chatting about the idea of sort of trying to, that was sort of my vision, was like, when I attend a lecture, I love when I get like those little historical backstories, like, like in 1712, Sir, whatever, Dr. John, whatever, decided this. And you're like, someone back then was thinking that. That's really fascinating. Or this midwife realized that you could do this with ergot, and then everybody started doing it. So I wanted to incorporate some of that into it. And so kind of have this like A, B story with the podcast, like the A story medicine, and the B story is, why do we think we do about that medicine? Or how did we get to think the way we did? So that's kind of how it came about.
And at the risk of being overly complimentary, I will say that somebody like me, like I don't know who you consider your demographic, but I found it so incredibly clear. And if anything wasn't clear, your analogies or I guess metaphors are just so great. That when you describe the hormones are like the bouncer at the nightclub, and the uterus it's an exclusive VIP venue that only allows some of the eggs, i.e. the party goers in. I've learned over time to sort of speak in pictures and paint a picture when you're on radio and podcast, and you do just a phenomenal job of that. So I will give an extra plug to your podcast, which is great listening. It really is.
Thank you. A friend of mine said that my superpower is analogies. So I'm like analogy woman. And I'm like, okay, so that's how I'm fighting the forces of pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this brings us to your new book out now, which is the Menopause Manifesto. So, you talked a bit about some of the other topics you've talked about, and then you talked about periods in your TED Talk. But what made you decide to do this book about menopause?
Well, a couple of things. I'd been thinking about it for a little while, but I had a couple of ideas. Maybe I'd write this book, and then I was on book tour actually for the Vagina Bible. And every stop, there were questions about menopause. And once one person asked a question, it was that opened the floodgates. And when I was even like doing interviews for the Vagina Bible, if menopause came up, then that's all people wanted to talk about. And I was like, whoa, okay, there's obviously a need here that I hadn't really thought about, because, like as a doctor, like, the biological process. So to you, you operate under this mistaken perception or mistaken idea that everybody knows this basic biology, right? Like, well, doesn't everybody know how the nervous system works? Like, well, no, actually, most people have no neurotransmitter and the thalamus and, all this kind of stuff. But we kind of take it for granted. And so there's that stepping stone that's always missing there. And so I started thinking about all these questions, and they're almost always the same. And they came from the same, like not getting enough information in the doctor's office, being tripped up by misinformation online when they started searching for it. And so I just thought there's clearly a need here. And that was something that I guess I was willing to tackle, even though so many people want to talk about menopause. It's one of those things that, doesn't get advertisers, isn't like popular, even though like half the population will eventually have it. And so I wanted to tackle it in the same way, like I did sort of the TED Talk, in a sense that I wanted people to understand like the culture and the history of menopause as well, because we've been sold this story that it's a sign of weakness. And we use these words like ovarian failure when actually, it's an evolutionary strength.
And it's interesting, actually, a couple of things stuck with me most from your podcast about menopause and stuff that you've written about in the book. There are terms referring to menopause, from textbooks in the past. Textbooks. Can you talk a little bit about those? I'd love for listeners to hear those from your mouth rather than mine.
Yeah, it's not actually always so old either. So up until recently, we've used the term vaginal atrophy for the changes that happen with menopause, which sounds awful, right? As opposed to genitourinary syndrome of menopause. Sounds, it's not catchy, but it's better. And we still, there's still words in medicine that are very pejorative. Like we say ovarian failure, like the ovaries are failing or loss of estrogen, but it's a planned event. It's not a failure. It's not like the thyroid stopping. Like this was always meant to happen. It's like saying the end of puberty is a failure. It's like, no, like that's meant to happen. Or the end of pregnancy, a normal term pregnancy is a failure. It was like, no, that's actually meant to happen. So, these terms affect how you think about yourself and your body. They have to, because, they get used over and over and over again. And that just adds to this sort of pejorative nature. I mean, it's not just about menopause. The word pudendum, which we use much more to describe the external genitalia for women than men. The Latin root of pudendum, pudere, is to shame. And, the Latin root for clitoris is to hide. And hymen is named after the Greek god of marriage. And to give a comparison, there's no body part in the man named after a Greek god, but priapism, which is a medical condition where, the penis is, I guess, got way long an erection that won't go away. I'm only an amateur penis expert, so I might have the terms wrong. But priapism is from Priapus, which is the Greek god of fertility. So like we use fertility for a male medical problem, and we use the god of marriage for normal anatomy. And that's stuff.
It's such a reminder that language matters in so many things. And of course, medicine is no exception to that. I was also left baffled by textbook terms like women's inferno and women's winter. And I was, wow, these got okayed.
Yeah, like these were actual terms that people used for menopause in the past. It's
in
those were
1800s
textbooks, right?
I mean, yeah, but the death of sex, women's winter. I mean, if the whole worldview of society is that you're already defective, and then you become more defective when you go into menopause, then you've become basically, you've ascended to a lower class of citizenry, right?
So we have had sort of in the docket a dozen questions for you from listeners who knew you were coming onto the show. People are so engaged with you just because of the way I think you've always had the blog and you've been engaged with people. And so you really elicited a lot of stuff. So we'll try to get to some of those questions right now. And we are not qualified to answer these, and we'd be remiss not to ask you because we have you here. So a writer, Martha, wrote in, I have a hot flash in the night. And you can speak about the term flash and your thoughts on that if you like. But she said, I have a hot flash in the night. I wake up so drenched in sweat that water is dripping out of my calves. I don't get the hot part as much as the sweat part. And what actually causes that?
Yeah. So hot flushes, which I like the term flush, which is also the British term. as opposed to flash, because it's not instantaneous. Like a flash is, just like that. And a flush lasts longer. Although I prefer the old term from the 1700s, hot blooms, because that's really what it feels like. It feels like it's blooming out of your head.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, some people, just as like neurological phenomenon can be expressed in so many weird different ways. And a hot flush is a neurological phenomenon. So what happens is thermoregulation, temperature control, and reproduction are intimately linked, because during the second half of your cycle, when you're more fertile, or the fertile period, your temperature goes up a little bit because that's better for implantation. And so obviously there's all these interconnections. So when your hormone levels change, you expect that maybe there might be some temperature dysregulation. And so there's these neurons in the brain. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but I think they're called KNDY, K-N-D-Y, and they're part of signaling heat. And so they say hot, hot, hot. But like everything in the body, there's stimulating pathways and there's inhibitory pathways. And estrogen's part of the inhibitory pathway that says, nope, we're not so hot. Nope, we're not so hot. Nope. So there's this back and forth. So without estrogen, you have more heat signals and you don't have as much sort of suppression. And it's possible that some of the other hormonal changes in menopause also drive this. So this is just possibly one explanation. And so your body thinks it's hot when it's not. And as we all know, it's in your brain where the magic happens. If your brain tells you something's happening, it's happening. And so you become hot, you feel hot. And now what do you do when you're hot? Your brain's hot. So it's not that your core temperature has actually risen. Your brain thinks your core temperature has risen. It feels like your core temperature has risen. So what do you do when your core temperature is rising? You dump heat. And what do you dump heat by? You dilate your blood vessel and send your blood to your head and your arms and your torso to get rid of heat. And then you start to sweat. And since there's a lot of autonomic instability associated with menopause that we don't really quite understand, some people sweat more than others. Some people are hot more than others. It's so fascinating. Some people have all the feeling of heat, but don't get the hot flush. And some people have the hot flush and they don't get the feeling of heat. So, we don't quite understand it all yet. But yeah, some people have them at night and don't wake up at all. I don't. I still have some. And my partner will be like, oh my God, the heat from your body actually woke me up. And I'm like, oh, I slept right through it.
Wow. So this is a related question we have from another listener, Charmaine. She says, what can women do about sleep disturbance during menopause? And I guess they're talking about maybe unrelated to hot flushes.
Well, sometimes they are related to hot flushes and you don't know, because some people don't have that heat feeling, right? Or they sleep through it, but what's happening is they're coming like out of REM and they're having a disturbed sleep. But like any medical problem, you can't just assume it's menopause, because that's also happening at a time when you're more likely to develop, for age-related sleep apnea or, other medical conditions. And so if you have a sleep disturbance, you should go in and be seen and be screened for depression and be screened for sleep apnea and be screened for all the causes of sleep disturbance. Sometimes it's because there's been a pandemic and you've on your phone till 11 o'clock at night, right? So you're not getting to sleep. So there could be a lot of reasons, and it could be everything, or it could be one of them, or it could be a few, right? That's just as that's the complicated part of medicine, is teasing out how many puzzle pieces are in this puzzle. Is it one piece? Is it 10 pieces? And which are the pieces? So yeah, so you do the workup. And if someone's having a lot of hot flushes during the day, well, chances are they're probably having them at night. And so then it may be related to that if you don't find any other causes. But like a lot of things in medicine too, where we don't have tests to tell us, sometimes you have to do a medication trial and see if it makes a difference.
Okay. We have a listener named Jen who says that she did a quick search on menopause, and in her searches, she found MBF, menopausal belly fat, mentioned enough times that she's thinking it might be a real thing. So her question is, what in God's name is it, and how the heck do I avoid it?
Well, so I think what they mean by that is visceral fat, which is the fat that's around our organs in our midsection. And that fat is inflammatory fat. So that's associated with increased risk of heart disease and diabetes, and even dementia. It's associated with a lot of medical conditions. And before menopause, men are more likely to put on visceral fat. And during the menopause transition, that sort of switch happens and women start putting on more visceral fat. And it's a complicated thing, like everything. Part of it's related to the loss of muscle mass during the menopause transition. So if you're losing muscle mass, but you're still taking the same amount of calories, you're not burning off as much. But there's other complicated hormonal changes as well. And so women start putting on visceral fat, which is one of the contributors to increasing rate of heart disease, during the menopause transition and afterwards. So they basically catch up to men. And so that's what it is. And sadly, it's sort of a normal part of the aging / menopause process. It also happens to men as well, but they don't have that sort of big switch, from sort of pear shape to kind of apple shape, if you will. And so the best way to prevent it is exercise and a healthy diet and calorie restriction. Those are the ways. They're not sexy. They're not easy. And I always tell people the healthiest thing they can do pre-menopause, during menopause, any time in their life is exercise. Basically, every single medical problem that's associated with menopause is improved by exercise. It even reduces your rate of dementia.
You bring up men, and that might not have been a good thing. I'm very grateful, of course, because now this apparently I have an inflamed liver. I have a fatty liver. And rather than blame it on beer and chicken wings, I can say it's just menopause, everybody. It's just male menopause. Can I go with that? No.
No. No, I'm not a hepatologist, and so I'm certainly not an expert in fatty liver. However, if you listen to the last episode of Body Stuff, I do talk to a hepatologist, and we do actually talk a little bit about fatty liver and glucose. So you might find that interesting.
So we have one question from Lauren, and she's asking, are there nutritional supplements that can help offset perimenopause symptoms? She's thinking like omega-3s. And similarly, what about calcium supplementation, and when would you look into that?
So I always call, supplements you have to be really careful about because, they're also the number one cause of medication-related liver failure. And most of them aren't tested at all. So I just got an email from some company telling me about their great menopause supplements. And I said, oh, that's really wonderful. Can you send me your clinical trials? And we're a small company. We don't have any clinical trials. Oh, great. Okay. So you have an untested pharmaceutical. Let's be clear about that. So I tell people to divide supplements into things that they are truly supplementing from their diet, meaning what are they missing from their diet that they should be having? So you should be having 1,200 milligrams of calcium a day if you're in menopause or close to menopause. So if you're only eating 800 milligrams a day, then you want to supplement with an additional 400 or 500, whatever dose that you can get in that's close enough to that, right? But if you're having 1,200 milligrams of calcium a day, you do not need a supplement. If you have a clinical diagnosis of osteoporosis, that may be different. So we're talking about people who don't have a diagnosis. Similarly, at the age of 50, our ability to make vitamin D drops significantly with age. And it's really hard to get from diet. And many of us are wearing sunscreen. And so probably taking a dose of, vitamin D, like 800 international units around that dose every day at the age of 50 is probably a good idea as well. Maybe if you live at the equator and you're outside in the sun, and where they have nice sun all the time, right? Like if you're in, Winnipeg, you don't get a lot of sun. You go to work in the dark, you come home in the dark, right? Like you're not getting sun exposure. It's just different. So vitamin D supplement. There's some data to suggest that people who don't have 2 servings of fatty fish a week can benefit from taking omega-3s. And obviously, if you're a vegan, you are going to need to look for a vitamin B12 supplement, either nutritional yeast or, whatever, however you want to take it, and possibly a supplement because, we all know that animal heme is easier to absorb than plant heme. So, you just want to know your numbers. But apart from that, there's actually no supplement that's needed. And I think it's really important. Those are making up a shortfall in the diet. They're not a treatment. So it's a different thing. That's like making sure your gas tank is full. That's it. So then there's all supplements that are meant for symptoms, and they are largely untested. And the ones that are largely ineffective, and some are harmful. And so the only 2 that have been shown to, and there's a whole chapter on this in the book, so I really encourage people who are interested to buy it, is Kool, which is a phytoestrogen, and something called Relazin, which is like a bee, like a bee pollen thing. And so, not bee pollen, but a pollen thing. And so those have been shown in some low quality, small studies to be helpful. They're probably not harmful. So those are the only 2 I can recommend. But for example, black cohosh, a popular one that's talked about, has not really ever been shown to be effective, is associated with liver failure. And here's the kicker. 25% of bottles of black cohosh in the United States don't contain any black cohosh at all.
Wow.
And
so
how
when they're
would
tested,
Right. Yeah. So somebody did a
Wow.
test because they wondered, and this is a really great question. They wondered how come people did well in some of the studies, but did terrible in other the studies. And is it because maybe some lots didn't have black co-wash or actually had less than they said? And so what they found was 25%. And they also wondered if that might explain some of the liver toxicity, right? Like, was it because of adulteration, which is a common problem in supplements? People don't understand that. If you're buying something for ovary support, it could contain estrogen. It could contain thyroid hormone. There's no regulation to prevent that from happening. So if you're getting a clinical effect, it could be because that supplement has a pharmaceutical in it and you will never know. And then all of a sudden you've got a liver failure and no one knows why. So people need to be so careful about those. Imagine if every time you opened a bottle of milk, there was a 25% chance it was orange. You'd be pretty angry, wouldn't you? Right? 25%. Like
placebo orange juice.
Well, so they wanted to know what the black cohosh was contaminated with because they thought perhaps it grows only in North America, right? So they thought perhaps maybe people were accidentally picking plant nearby, right? Like that they were scooped up too much. Well, what the black cohosh that didn't black cohosh had was plants that weren't native to North America, plants that, from other countries. So purposely adulterated.
We only have really time for maybe one more question. I think this is maybe a good one to sort of wrap things up on, which is a question that is, what one health habit can I do now to reduce symptoms of menopause later? Is there an option to go through it all unscathed?
Yeah. So, we only hear the horror stories about menopause, but lots of people don't have any problems. And, for example, 25% of people don't have any hot flushes at all. So I think that's important to remember. We all have different tolerance levels too about what symptoms bother us and what don't. And for most people, the menopause transition is the worst phase. Kind of like puberty is the worst phase, right? Mm-hmm. And then you get through those rocky years and you're okay. And some people are happy, maybe not happy, but they are content to manage that rocky time without medications. Everybody's different. Everybody views their body differently. But the single thing that you could do is exercise, besides quitting smoking. If you're a smoker, quit smoking. But if you're not a smoker, it's exercise. That is the single best thing that you can do for your overall health for menopause. It's not going to reverse symptoms like hot flushes or vaginal dryness, but it's going to keep you in the best of health. It's going to help prevent things like osteoporosis and diabetes and heart disease. And those things shorten your lifespan. And also, if have to take medication for heart disease, you might have side effects from those medications. Like hot flushes can actually be a side effect from some medications. People forget that. So the healthier you keep yourself, the better you're going to sleep. The exercise can help depression. So exercise.
Okay.
And Dr. Gunter, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We really appreciate it. And I want to share you something. We had such an influx of emails for questions for you from our listeners. And it made me realize as you were talking, it's because people trust you. They trust you on Twitter. They trust you on social media. And it really means a lot, I think, to not just women, men as well. I mean, I follow you on social media and we really value your opinion because you stand by what you say and it's evidence-based. So people who agree with that, which I think is almost all of our listeners, you need to check out the Menopause Manifesto. I read it. It's great. I have a line of people saying, can I borrow that from you? Can I borrow that from you? I'm like, just buy it. Please just buy it. It's great.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm always like a little nervous explaining neurology to a neurologist. I'm like, ooh, the brain, right? Pathways. Ooh. Thank you so much for having me on. And I think people get that I'm curious and I want the answers. And I just want people to have the facts because I hate seeing people get scammed. It's just so awful. And you feel so badly for people in the office. And you just think, wow, what if we could have prevented this? People come in with reams of blood tests they didn't need and they spent $1,000 or more. And then what it's like once someone's, it's not just in medicine. Once you've spent money on something that's not working out, it's so hard. We buy into that sunk cost fallacy and we keep spending more money. And, I just feel really bad for people. And, and also, we in medicine have to do a better job of communicating. So, yeah. But thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Our genuine pleasure. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Bye.
And go Mustangs.
Exactly.
Start with a Western joke, end with a Western joke. Good stuff. Good book ending there, you guys.
Take care.
Take care, Dr. Gunter.
Bye-bye.
That was Dr. Jen Gunter, physician, OBGYN, pain medicine specialist, columnist, podcaster, and now the author of the new book, The Menopause Manifesto. We thank her very much for being on the show today.
Yeah, she was amazing. We really appreciate her having her on. She's really great. And like we said in the interview, lots of you follow her on Twitter. Definitely recommend picking up her book. And for us, just remember to follow us on social media. Dr. V Comedian. Again, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube as well. If you want to listen to our podcast on YouTube, the video is just like a still image that says Doctor versus Comedian, but some people like listening to it on YouTube. And if you could just do us one favor, you guys have been great with the ratings and reviews. We've loved that. But if you could just, any of you are on Reddit podcasts, if you could go to that site, and if you write stuff on Reddit a lot or you upvote things there, if you could just mention Doctor versus Comedian there, it would really help us out. And remember that although I'm a doctor, as is Dr. Gunter, we are not your doctor. So medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only. They are not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks everyone for listening. See ya.
Thanks. See ya.